Hi everyone, welcome to Main Street Farms. This is our first video class. So we are going to be talking about season extension and working in a high tunnel. So right now I'm at our urban location of Main Street Farms in downtown Cortland. We have 3 high tunnels here that have been up for the last 5 years, and it's on land that was previously a railroad car transfer station. So we did a lot of soil amendments here, and we're pretty careful with our site selection because we have really good drainage, and we also had access to this land. So what is a high tunnel? So our high tunnels are temporary structures that are covered in plastic, and our point is to be able to extend our season and also to grow year-round. So what are we growing? You can see behind me we have some rows of spinach and also of Swiss chard. So we're growing these greens in the winter when we're not able to grow much else. And we are also growing different plants here in the summertime. So we have our warm season and our cold season crops. Our warm season crops are hung on these strings that are attached to the framing above. And that is to be able to utilize all of the space and all of the time that we have available in our high tunnels, because our high tunnels are expensive to build and to maintain. So it's essentially valuable real estate, and we want to use that real estate as best we can. So for our winter greens, these get started in about October, and they're growing just as the cold is coming, and then their growth cycle slows during the winter months, and we're able to harvest them kind of throughout the season. And we sell them at farmers markets and through our CSA, so we're able to have the little extra time and utilize this space the best we can. So there's a few things that we want to make sure that we're thinking about when we're choosing a site for building a high tunnel. This land, it was available to us through a small business who just wanted someone to use the land, but when folks are siting their high tunnels on the farm, like we have at our main location at Main Street Farms, they're going to think about things like the weather, so not having really high winds that can blow your plastic off if you can, having access to water resources, so if you have a well and you want to have drip irrigation, and also to electricity, because you might want to use lights or use fans or potentially have electric roll-up sides. So those are some things that you want to think about, along with soil. So you want to choose soil that you would otherwise be farming on, something that is high quality and that won't require too many amendments if possible. And our location right here is, like I said, in an urban area, so you might hear some people and some dogs around me, or car traffic on the road. And some other things we want to think about is our access to light. So not having it be in too shady of a location, but potentially also supported by windbreaks to be able to ease the pressure on your high tunnel plastic. You might also want to consider things like your direction that you're placing your high tunnel. So most of our high tunnels all run east-west, so we're getting the most light that we can to help our plants. Things we want to consider when we're choosing which crops we're going to grow. One of the main things is how profitable is that crop, because this is a high expense structure to maintain and to build. So overall, one of the main crops that are grown in high tunnels in this area that are most profitable is tomatoes. There's a few reasons for this. One has to do with moisture. So when you're in high tunnel, you don't have to worry about water getting on the leaves if you are not doing any overhead watering. So all of that drip irrigation is really important to manage pest and disease. Tomatoes are pretty susceptible to diseases, and when we protect them from outside spores being blown into the greenhouse or the high tunnel, and then also on top of that managing the water and humidity, and the condensation coming from above, we're able to really cut down on the amount of diseases that tomatoes have. Also, for tomatoes, we want to be able to give them some structure to grow on. So for that reason, we use ropes that are hanging from the overhead beams, and there's these little plastic clips that go on the ropes, and they can support the tomatoes and they can grow upwards. So that upward movement means that we're using the space as best we can, and we're trying to use every square foot to be as profitable as possible. When we are trellising our tomatoes and having them grow up towards the top of the high tunnel, we're also helping with air circulation because we're removing the leaves on the bottom and we're allowing more air and ventilation to get into the high tunnel. Good management is really important for high tunnels because the chances of pest and disease pressure are really high. So some of the ways that we manage pests in high tunnels is by managing our humidity, our temperature, and our ventilation. On high tunnels, I'm going to back up so you can see this. We have gables, and these can be opened up in the summertime. And we also have door structures on the front and in the back. And these door structures can be opened up during the summertime, warmer months, and when it gets really hot, our side walls are able to roll up and down, and these ones are on a electric system, so it's automatic up and down based on a temperature gauge that is inside the greenhouse, and that means there's less management for us in terms of making sure someone comes down here to roll up the side. Overall, one of the main crops that are grown in high tunnels in this area that are most profitable is tomatoes. And there's a few reasons for this. One has to do with moisture. So when you're in high tunnel, you don't have to worry about water getting on the leaves if you are not doing any overhead watering. So all of that drip irrigation is really important to manage pest and disease. Tomatoes are pretty susceptible to diseases, and when we protect them from outside spores being blown into the greenhouse or the high tunnel, and then also on top of that managing the water and humidity and the condensation coming from above, we're able to really cut down on the amount of diseases that tomatoes have. Also, for tomatoes, we want to be able to give them some structure to grow on. So for that reason, we use ropes that are hanging from the overhead beams, and there's these little plastic clips that go on the ropes, and they can support the tomatoes and they can grow upwards. So that upward movement means that we're using the space as best we can, and we're trying to use every square foot to be as profitable as possible. When we are trellising our tomatoes and having them grow up towards the top of the high tunnel, we're also helping with air circulation because we're removing the leaves on the bottom and we're allowing more air and ventilation to get into the high tunnel. Behind me is another one of our high tunnels on the farm. This one currently doesn't have the plastic on it. This because the plastic needs to be replaced about every 4 years. So when we are choosing the plastic, we want to think about how much light is going to penetrate that type of plastic, because we want the light to get to our plants, but also how thick that plastic is and how long it's going to last. And there's two ways of doing plastic on high tunnels. The first one is to do a single layer, and that tends to be less expensive, but it's also more susceptible to snowfall and to caving in. The second method is to do a double layer of plastic over the top and then have a small fan that's pushing air in between them to make an insulation layer. So that layer is going to help increase the temperature of the high tunnels in the winter. And one of the downsides is that it doesn't let quite as much light in, and it's a little more expensive to have 2 rows of plastic. So on this high tunnel, we took our plastic off because it came to the end of its life and was starting to degrade. So this is actually a good thing also for our soil management, because we leave the plastic off over the winter and let that soil recharge, because we don't want to be growing crops year after year in the same soil without doing more management to make sure the quality of that soil is really high. So here we grew a winter cover crop. You can see that it's mostly dead now, but that cover crop is going to be tilled in the spring, and eventually this is going to move back into our production after the new plastic gets put on, and we're going to be growing eggplants and peppers in this high tunnel later on. So we're going to move over to our other high tunnel at this location, and this one's structured a little differently because this one has a door on it. So we want to make sure that we're managing our greenhouses for temperature. So in the summer, this big part, the big plastic part, gets opened up and we can get our equipment, our small tractors in there. And then in the winter, we don't want to open up that whole space and let out the heat that's in there. So we have a human door, and we're going to head right inside here. And here we have growing, we've got some kale that's looking like it's getting to be the end of its life, which makes sense because we're almost to spring. And we have some spinach here, some lettuce that's recently been harvested for our winter CSA, more spinach. This sells really well at the farmer's market, and we have some very bolted arugula over there. And part of our winter management practices is to use this grow cover. So grow cover is a light fabric. We talked about it in class. Here's a picture of how this works. So this grow cover is penetrable by light and from moisture. And it's pretty light. It's like thinner than, I guess, a bed sheet. And this goes right over the crops, and it's held down with either ground staples or with rocks. So this grow cover helps our plants by doing a few different things. One, it keeps the temperature up. So that little bit of difference in temperature on the plants helps us extend into the shoulder season. And that means we can grow earlier in the spring, but also later in the fall. It also helps with our pest management. So we're keeping pests out and insects out that would otherwise be munching on our plants. That's especially important outside in the field. Even though some larger animals like deer are going to step on it, but it's still worthwhile to use. And then also it keeps the weed pressure down, so it's preventing weed seeds from getting blown into that bed. This video that I'm taking today is filmed mostly on our urban farm location, which means that I have stopped it and started it to avoid the various car alarms, sirens, and people shouting on the street. So bear with me for this one. Our other recordings for class are going to be on a few other farms, as well as having one live Zoom call with Kate Downs from New York FarmNet. So that's going to be our only live class for the rest of the semester. I hope you all are doing well and staying healthy.